Hello everyone. I wanted to briefly talk about a disease that's been in the news this past week, which up until now, even if you're a medical professional, you've probably never heard of. Zika virus. What is it? Why is it important? And did every major media outlet botch the story on it? Over the past few days, there has been a sudden outpouring of news stories that are talking about this emerging disease, Zika, particularly as it pertains to a current outbreak in Brazil. There, the Ministry of Health has raised concern that the virus may be the cause of a dramatic increase in the incidence of microcephaly, a severe birth defect in which the size of the skull, and thus the brain inside, is much smaller than normal. I'm going to come back to Brazil, but let's first talk about what Zika is and where it originally came from. Zika is a member of the flavivirus genus of viruses. This genus also includes dengue, West Nile, and yellow fever. Zika shares with these viruses their ability to be transmitted to humans via bites from infected mosquitoes. This makes them also arboviruses, that is, viruses spread by arthropods. In addition to their insect connection, arboviruses share many other common features. Many people who are exposed to the virus don't get symptoms at all. When symptoms do occur, they come several days to several weeks after exposure. Symptoms typically include some combination of fever, headache, rash, arthralgias, that is, sore joints, conjunctivitis, vague abdominal pain, and malaise. The most severely affected patients can develop encephalitis or inflammation of the brain. Those with mild symptoms recover after several days. Those with severe symptoms may take several weeks. In the modern era, death from arboviruses is relatively uncommon, provided that conventional medical care is available to the patient, since many of these diseases strike in impoverished areas of the tropics that may not always be the case. Now, where does Zika come from? It was first isolated from a rhesus monkey in Uganda in 1947, specifically within Uganda's Zika forest. The first cases of human infection were identified in Nigeria in the 1950s. Since then, Zika has been really quiet up until the 21st century, when limited outbreaks began occurring throughout the world, particularly in the Pacific Islands. And evidence of Zika infection, either from patients with clinical illness or with serologic evidence of prior exposure, has been found in dozens of countries on 5 continents. So why haven't we heard about Zika until now? I mean, if this emerging disease has been causing outbreaks across the globe for the past 10 years, why has it flown under the radar, unlike diseases like Ebola or SARS? Well, there's 2 key reasons it hasn't previously made its way into the Western press. First, infections tend to be mild. In fact, the CDC reports that only 1 in 5 people who are infected with Zika actually develop symptoms. The others clear the infection so rapidly they don't even get sick. Illness severe enough to require hospitalization is rare, and the CDC website further states that there has never been a reported death from Zika, though media reports from Brazil do mention 2 to 3 possible deaths there. The second reason why we haven't heard about it in the US until now is that the Zika virus is contained to the tropics. It has not been seen in the US or Europe yet, and there are plenty of diseases right here on our own soil that Americans don't seem to care enough about, like measles or influenza. I wouldn't expect them to care about some seemingly esoteric mild illness from Uganda. This, of course, brings us back to Brazil, and why the media and the public are starting to take notice of it. In May 2015, Brazil reported its very first case of Zika. There is speculation that the disease was brought from Asia or the Pacific Islands by tourists during the 2014 World Cup, but that seems highly speculative and probably unprovable. Regardless, since then there has been an outbreak that has spread to other countries in Latin America. Unfortunately, since most patients are asymptomatic or minimally symptomatic, and the symptoms mimic those of more familiar diseases such as dengue, and since there is no readily available test in your typical medical clinic to detect the Zika virus, it's very difficult to know how large an outbreak this has been. One potential strategy might be for researchers to check the blood of thousands of healthy individuals looking for anti-Zika antibodies. If one assumes that Zika did not exist in Brazil prior to this outbreak, then one could use the prevalence of the antibodies in the general population to calculate how many total cases there have been. Using either this or an alternative strategy, it's not clear, Brazil's health ministry has estimated that between 500,000 and 1.5 million people have been infected by Zika. That's a lot of people, most of whom are in the northeastern part of the country. Concurrent with this stealth outbreak, in October of this year, doctors began to notice a dramatic increase in the number of babies born with microcephaly. As mentioned at the beginning, microcephaly is a birth defect in which the head fails to fully develop in utero, resulting in poor brain growth. Depending upon the extent of concurrent developmental problems, babies born with microcephaly either die at birth or suffer from significant mental retardation and other neurologic issues. CNN reported that 20 Brazilian states, which contains the large majority of the population, had 147 cases of microcephaly in 2014 and over 2,400 in 2015, a dramatic 1,600% increase. And here's where it gets exciting. In November, a researcher apparently found Zika virus present during the autopsy of a newborn with microcephaly. Thus began the story of the Zika-fueled epidemic of microcephaly in Brazil. Now, some people are starting to get really concerned. This probably includes Brazil's Olympic Committee in preparation for the 2016 Games in Rio. And prominent news websites are posting stories with titles such as CNN's Brazil warns against pregnancy due to spreading virus, and The Guardian's Brazil warns women not to get pregnant as Zika virus is linked to rare birth defect. So now, let's discuss the problems with this story and why what's being reported in the media doesn't add up at all. First, the Brazilian health ministry is not warning women against getting pregnant. The warning came as the unofficial opinion of one Claudio Maiorovic, who is the director of Brazil's Department of Communicable Disease Surveillance. It is not an official recommendation from the health ministry or the national government, as CNN and The Guardian have misstated, likely intentionally for more clicks. This is just one guy's personal opinion. Granted, he might be incredibly knowledgeable about the problem, but it still doesn't make it Brazil's recommendation. Second, the numbers for Brazil's baseline rate of microcephaly, as presented in the media, simply don't make sense. Microcephaly is conventionally defined as an occipital-frontal head circumference more than either 2 or 3 standard deviations below the mean for a given age and gender. Brazil has about 3 million births per year. Even if head circumference does not adhere to a normal distribution, it still seems impossible that only 147 Brazilian babies fell below 3 standard deviations of the mean per year, as in off by 1 to 2 orders of magnitude impossible. I'll admit that neither the published literature nor international health officials seem to be questioning this implausibly low number, but they should be skeptical of it. In addition, as public knowledge in Brazil of Zika has skyrocketed, doctors are probably more likely to identify and report babies who are microcephalic, thus contributing to the reported increase. But perhaps an even bigger issue is that an association between two things is not remotely the same as a cause-effect relationship. The prevalence of microcephaly has possibly increased, and there is currently a Zika outbreak of unknown but probably significant size. Those two things might be related, but they also might be coincidental. And if 1 million Brazilians have been infected already, it stands to reason that thousands of them were pregnant at the time. Since, as I mentioned, Brazil sees about 3 million births per year, at least 2,400 of whom have reportedly had microcephaly in 2015, that's a microcephaly rate of roughly 1 in 1,000 births. So if thousands of pregnant women were infected with Zika, even if there was no cause and effect whatsoever between these two problems, a handful of babies with microcephaly would have been exposed to Zika from chance alone. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that Zika is not associated with microcephaly. I'm just saying that the link is speculative and that the media coverage of the Brazilian outbreak has been less than stellar. While the media has implied a cause-effect relationship, the worldwide body of peer-reviewed scientific literature has just a tiny handful of articles that even mention a possible link between Zika and microcephaly, literally all of which were published in the last 2 weeks, and none of which presents any substantial hard data at all. The CDC's website states the association is still under investigation, and the World Health Organization's website doesn't seem to mention the possible link anywhere. So for the media to present this speculation as fact is at best premature. This does a disservice to science in general because whenever speculation turns out to be incorrect, there's a significant chance the public will never hear about the correction. So what's the take-home message here? Zika is an important pathogen and worthy of further study. It may very well turn out to be a significant cause of birth defects. But I would not sell off your tickets to the Rio Olympics quite yet. And if you're traveling to Brazil and are either pregnant or planning to get pregnant, I would not freak out about it. Just be smart about mosquito exposure. Wear long sleeves, use insect repellents, and keep your doors and windows closed, particularly if you'll be in the northeastern part of the country. The real bottom line here is that the media can get ahead of the science when it comes to stories which are prone to sensationalism, so don't always accept what you read at face value.